Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. A World War II hero to many, but during a career that spanned more than 70 years, he also generated some controversy. We continue now with our panel. Let's go to Louise in London. And Louise, let me start by asking you about something that you said about Churchill's legacy. You said it was contradictory. On the one hand, he played a major role in defeating Nazism. On the other, in his lifetime, we saw the breakup of the British Empire. Expand on that for us.
Well, there's no question that he got some things right. His focus on Hitler and the rise of Hitler was vitally important. If we'd had Halifax instead of Churchill, that would have been a disaster. We would have carried on appeasing Germany. But he was not just obsessed with Nazism at that time. He was also obsessed with the empire, with India. He did a tremendous amount of harm, refusing to cede any kind of independence to India. There are women who died, like Matangini Hazra, who died resisting British rule directly as a result of that obsession Churchill had, because his dad was an imperialist and he was an imperialist, and he was not going to let India go. He was going to use it as a resource to fight the war. So he was an extremely imperialist person. And I also want to look at women in England, the suffragettes, for example. Black Friday in 1910 was the most horrific and vicious attack on women by the state. Women were assaulted by police, by undercover police, by gangs of men in general for up to 6 hours. Women died as a result, were severely injured as a result. There was sexual assault en masse. And Churchill never called the police to account after that. So it wasn't just his terrible treatment of those he did definitely regard as racially inferior. The same thing applied to anyone who dared to stand up to the British state in Britain as well.
Michael, those are pretty serious indictments there. The fact that he didn't call the police when we saw this violence taking place, his views on race.
I mean, there's no doubt that in the 1930s, his views on India were outside of the mainstream of his party, and you could conceivably argue that he was wrong. But he did predict that Indian independence and partition would be followed by mass slaughter, which in fact it was. And in an historical irony, a lot of the people who were most supportive of Indian independence ended up being appeasers. So, you know, history's full of ironies. There's no doubt that that Churchill had strong views on India. He was an imperialist, and he was a very staunch one. But in the end, he knew that giving his all and giving Britain's all to defeating Hitler would probably result in the end of empire, and he was willing to pay that price in order to preserve freedom. Okay, Richard, what is your view on what you've just heard?
Well, I would rather say that he very much didn't regard the war as necessarily leading to the end of the British Empire. He said, "I've not become the King's first minister in order to preside over the end of the British Empire." So I think that at that point he believed that the empire could indeed be maintained as a going concern. Yes, he knew that it was necessary to be strategic. It was necessary to ally Britain with the Americans very strongly in order to maintain the empire's position. But I think at that point he thought that the empire did have a viable future, and indeed that's why he dug his heels in so hard over the question of Indian independence. I guess the thing that I would qualify the remarks that have been made about his imperialism actually is that if you look, you've got to remember that for 20 years, from 1904, he was actually a liberal rather than a conservative. His first ministerial job was as a junior minister at the Colonial Office, and actually during the first months when he was at the Colonial Office, he was regarded as being a danger to the empire because he was insufficiently sympathetic to the views of white settlers. So actually, we have this view that he was somebody of, I mean, he said himself that he was a child of the Victorian age, but rather than his views having got set in stone in 1900 and never having changed, actually they did evolve over time. He actually moved to the right in the interwar years.
Vijay, when we look at Churchill's role in the empire, and the fact that, as Michael pointed out a moment ago, that he was an imperialist, was that overshadowed completely by the fact that he played such a huge role in the defeat of Nazism that his views on the empire were trumped, actually, by the fact that Britain defeated Nazism?
Well, I find it curious that you say that Churchill defeated Nazism. you know, this is the other great revision that's taking place alongside the rehabilitation, in a way, of colonialism. And that is that we forget that there was of course, Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union played an immense role in the defeat of Nazism. And in fact, the great sacrifices of the Soviets, not only in Stalingrad, but across the line against the Nazis, you know, gets cut off when we concentrate on this or that moral fiber speech given by Winston Churchill. So, you know, I'd just like to qualify this rose-tinted view of Churchill somehow as being the great bulldog standing up against Nazism, which seems to elide, you know, the historical record where the Soviets played a very considerable role. And so did the armies from the colonies, I mean, play a very dramatic role in that war. You know, so many films are made, not only The Darkest Hour, but so many films are made of World War II, which show the armies of the Allies being essentially white men fighting in the trenches against the Germans. These films, you know, seem to bury over the Indian soldiers that fought against the Nazis, the West African soldiers that fought against the Nazis, indeed, the very important colonial wars that took place in North Africa against Rommel's troops. So it's not just Churchill that wins that war.
Right.
It was a very heroic effort by people from across the world that fought against the evil of Nazism.
Right, I didn't mean to disregard the role played, the very important role played by the Soviet Union and others in the defeat of Nazism, but we are talking about Churchill.
Could I just say,
talking
though,
about his role.
His role was indispensable in 1940. He was responsible not for winning the war, but for not losing it. Nobody claims otherwise. And remember that at the time that Churchill was arguing with Halifax and standing up for taking the fight to Hitler, Stalin and Hitler had a formal alliance, which only ended with Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941.
Could I just
Yes,
say that?
go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to say we should look at how he became Prime Minister in the first place, and that was the absolute disaster of Norway, which he's pretty much responsible for, which left a lot of British soldiers dead, which left Norwegians dead. And it was because of that that he became Prime Minister in the first place. So he became Prime Minister, ironically, because of a huge military mistake that he made against the Nazis.
Well, let's talk about his role in the Cold War. Of course, he also lived through the early years of the Cold War. He's the man, in fact, who was responsible for coining that phrase, the Iron Curtain. What is your assessment, Louise, of Winston Churchill in the latter part of his career?
I think that he should not have come back. I think that he should have retired in 1945 for a number of reasons. And we should remember that as well when we talk about how much the Britons love and revere Churchill. He was voted out in 1945, right at the peak of his success in defeating the Nazis in World War II. As Vijay correctly says, not single-handedly. This was not Churchill with his bayonet single-handedly. The Americans, Pearl Harbor, the Russians had a lot to do with it as well. But I think he did a lot of damage to his reputation in his final prime ministership. If it hadn't been for his desperation to hang on and not let Anthony Eden succeed him, we had a kind of Blair Brown, a situation that we saw in Britain, which was quite destructive generally, two people competing to be prime minister to the benefit of neither, and certainly not to the country. I just think Winston, give it up. We should have gone in 1945.
Richard, how is Winston Churchill looked at in Britain today? Is there any kind of re-evaluation of his life and the role he played in British politics in the war effort at all now in Britain?
Well, I think there's a constant re-evaluation, really, and that does, in fact, reflect the divided views that were held about him, indeed, during his lifetime, that he was always a controversial figure. Sometimes, obviously, during 1940 to 1945, he went a very long way to sort of transcending party politics and becoming a truly national figure. But at the end of the war in the 1945 election, reverted to being a very sort of controversial figure who was sort of very vituperative towards his opponents. So I think that there's always a bit of a mismatch between the historians, who are always sort of re-evaluating his reputation, and the popular discussion. And so I think that at some level now, the Darkest Hour film has kind of led to a sort of a further surge of enthusiasm of the traditional picture, but it also has stirred up some of those long-lasting sort of resentments and criticisms, which Louise mentioned earlier, in various parts of the country and indeed around the world, so that each iteration of the myth, if you like, also provokes an iteration of the anti-Churchill viewpoint, and I think that some of the anti-Churchill viewpoints are themselves also myths to a degree.
And Vijay, what about the view in India, in a country like India? Has the view always been of Churchill as a very, very controversial person who did some very controversial things, or are we seeing renewed criticism of him right now?
I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that Churchill took a fundamental position against the Indian freedom struggle. His comments about Gandhi were emblematic of what he felt of Indian freedom. At no point did Churchill indicate that he felt that India, should win its independence. So I don't see how it's possible for Indians to reevaluate Churchill in a positive light. I think that would be quite extraordinary for Indian historian to write a book in India saying that, Churchill has a mixed legacy. I think it was quite amazing that your guest earlier said that Churchill was right in predicting there would be partition. You need to have another entire show on the question of partition and how that came about. It's difficult for me to let stand a statement that says essentially that the British were like the lid that kept Indian violence down. That's a very colonial attitude, and I'm surprised to hear it in 2018.
Michael, I've only got 30 seconds left. Here we have Churchill. He was, in many ways, larger-than-life man, very iconic. Britons still revere him in many respects. But, when we think of the pictures of Churchill, the cigars, the whiskies, he was also a prolific author. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. How did he manage all of that?
He had a remarkable, titanic amount of energy that's almost superhuman. He was literally larger than life in many ways. He also developed a facility for dictating. So he was able to smoke a cigar, walk back and forth in his study, and dictate for hours on end in complete paragraphs. In the end, he ended up publishing more words than Shakespeare and Dickens combined. So he not only saved Western civilization, but he recorded that saving in deathless prose.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us.